Pam Bondi had seen her fair share of courtroom battles. Over the years, she'd stood before judges and juries, taking on some of the most challenging cases in the country. She was no stranger to pressure, but something about today felt different. As she entered Judge Howard Gates' courtroom, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Judge Gates was known for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings, and she knew that today's hearing would be no exception. The case at hand was one that could shake careers. Allegations of a government ethics violation involving a wealthy developer with deep political ties. The developer stood accused of funneling state funds into his private projects. The evidence was strong, and Bondi had prepared meticulously for the day. What she hadn't prepared for, however, was the hostility that radiated from the bench. From the moment Bondi approached the plaintiff's table, Judge Gates didn't even look up. He flipped through a file with deliberate slowness, letting the courtroom sit in uncomfortable silence. It wasn't just the usual courtroom quiet. This silence had a purpose. It was a statement. "Miss Bondi," he finally said without glancing up, "I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" The chuckles that followed, mostly from the defendant's legal team, only added to the tension. Bondi kept her composure. She'd faced worse. "Your Honor," she began calmly, "I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Judge Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "Taxpayer dollars," he drawled. "Right, because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." Bondi's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." For a brief moment, their eyes locked, his cold and calculating, hers unwavering. But before she could continue, he cut her off again. "Mrs. Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it was clear that everyone present could feel the tension rising. Judges were tough, but this was different. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was personal. Pam took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew what was happening. Judge Gates was trying to throw her off balance, trying to control the tempo of the case, to put her on the defensive, but she wasn't about to let him have that satisfaction. She picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open. "Your Honor," she began, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A." She didn't let the moment hang for too long. "These financial records clearly demonstrate—" "Miss Bondi," Judge Gates interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating for something?" The courtroom shifted. The defense attorney smirked. A few reporters exchanged glances, but Bondi didn't flinch. She knew exactly what Gates was trying to do. Men like him thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was to never show them that they rattled you. She paused just long enough to make her statement without speaking a word. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she set the folder down and clapped her hands together. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't disrespectful, but it was pointed, a warning, and it landed. Judge Gates's lips curled slightly, as though he wasn't sure whether to be amused or annoyed. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi. I just know a weak case when I see one," he said with a sneer. This time the courtroom didn't just murmur. There were actual gasps. A few people whispered under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Bondi, however, kept her focus. She adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers, and locked eyes with Gates. She wasn't going to engage in his game, not yet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unshaken, "I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as she spoke, she noticed something in his expression. It wasn't just arrogance or condescension. There was something else, a flicker of something deeper, a glimpse into the soul of a man who had a stake in the outcome of this case. And that's when she knew. This wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't just being combative for sport. He had something to hide. But what? Pam Bondi had been in plenty of tense hearings before, but this one was different. Judge Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But she wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker with every passing moment. Pam Bondi could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of everyone's eyes on her as she continued to navigate the verbal sparring with Judge Gates. The case, which had started as a straightforward government ethics violation, had now become a battle of wills between her and a man who had the power to control the very fate of this trial. Pam kept her composure, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the personal jabs or the hostile atmosphere. No, there was something deeper at play here. Judge Gates wasn't merely challenging her case. He was trying to bury it, attempting to discredit her at every turn. Despite his dismissive behavior, Pam pressed forward. She knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about the integrity of the justice system, and she couldn't let Gates derail it. She flipped through her notes and glanced at the screen behind her, where the financial documents she had prepared for this hearing were now projected. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice unwavering, "these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount originally approved in the budget, and none of it is accounted for in the state records." She gestured toward the screen, waiting for the judge to acknowledge the glaring evidence. But instead of paying attention to the facts, Gates waved his hand dismissively. "Miss Bondi," he said, his tone oozing with condescension, "I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." Bondi's brow furrowed, but she didn't let his words distract her. She glanced at the defense table, where the defendant's lawyer was still smiling smugly. Bondi knew this was the moment where things could spiral out of control, and if she didn't keep her focus, Gates would get the upper hand. "Your Honor," she continued, "with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case. If we are to seek justice, we must examine the evidence thoroughly." Judge Gates leaned back in his chair, rolling his eyes as if he was bored with her words. "And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this." A small gasp echoed through the gallery. This was not typical behavior for a judge, even one with a reputation for being difficult. Pam's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. She wasn't going to let him derail her. This wasn't a matter of pride, it was a matter of principle. She straightened her posture, deciding that the time for patience was over. "Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." For a brief moment, there was silence. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Gates smirked, clearly enjoying the power he was wielding in that moment. But Bondi was not about to let him continue with his game. She reached for the next piece of evidence, flipping through the pages of her file, her hands steady despite the mounting pressure. "Your Honor," she said, "if you refuse to engage with the evidence, I'll be forced to ask for a recess so that we may address the issues with your behavior." The room went still. Even the defense attorney, who had been enjoying the show, now appeared slightly unnerved. For a brief moment, Pam saw a flicker of doubt in Gates's eyes. He wasn't expecting that. But before he could react, she added, "It's clear that the integrity of this hearing is being compromised, and I believe it would be in the best interest of the court to take a step back." Judge Gates didn't flinch. His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was one of irritation, as though she had just ruined the fun. "I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice low and steady, but with a tinge of annoyance. "I just know a weak case when I see one." A few people in the gallery gasped, but no one dared speak. The tension in the room was suffocating, and it seemed as if every eye in the courtroom was focused on the two of them. Bondi held her ground, refusing to show any signs of vulnerability. The defense attorney took advantage of the silence, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. Bondi didn't need to look at him to know that he was pleased with how things were going. He was watching her squirm, waiting for her to make a mistake. Pam, however, didn't intend to make any mistakes. She knew the stakes were high, and she wasn't going to let Gates' provocations undermine her. She set the next document in front of her and continued. "Your Honor," she said, maintaining her calm demeanor, These documents show that the defendant's company funneled funds into personal projects, all while misreporting their financial dealings. This isn't a speculative claim. This is clear, documented evidence of corruption. As she spoke, she caught a subtle change in Judge Gates's expression. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of something deeper. It wasn't just arrogance or condescension. There was something else, something Pam couldn't quite place. Judge Gates's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his position, but his smirk never faltered. It was clear now. This wasn't just a simple case of judicial bias. No, there was something more sinister at play here. But what was it? What was Judge Gates trying to hide? Bondi had a feeling that the answer was just within reach. She adjusted her blazer and continued to lay out the evidence. But the growing tension between her and the judge was palpable. Pam knew she was close, too close to the truth to stop now. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and as she stood there, presenting the evidence that could destroy the case for the defense, she realized something. This wasn't just about a developer abusing public funds. This was about something much bigger, and she was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. It wasn't just the way he shifted in his chair, or how his fingers drummed on the bench in nervous rhythm. There was a subtle, yet unmistakable shift in his eyes, a look of concern masked by arrogance. He could no longer hide his discomfort, and for the first time since the trial had begun, Pam sensed that he was no longer in control. She took a breath and continued, each word more deliberate than the last. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but commanding, "I would like to submit the next piece of evidence." She placed another document on the projection screen, this one a contract signed by the defendant and the city's planning board. This document clearly shows the proposed expenses for the project, totaling just over $2 million. But as you can see from the internal ledger obtained through a subpoena, the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. A hush fell over the courtroom. Pam's gaze flicked between the judge and the defense table. The defendant's lawyer had stopped smirking. The once confident demeanor of the defense attorney was now replaced with something akin to unease. Judge Gates, however, wasn't ready to let the matter go so easily. He leaned forward, his voice strained with a hint of desperation. "That document," he said, his words clipped, "is inadmissible." Pam raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me, Your Honor." Gates tried to regain his composure, his jaw tight. "That document was obtained improperly. It will not be considered by this court." His voice was cold and authoritative, as if he had the final word on the matter. But Bondi wasn't backing down. Not now, not when she was so close to exposing the truth. "Your Honor," she said, her tone unwavering, "this document was subpoenaed by my office, and it is entirely admissible in this court. It is part of the evidence we are presenting to prove the defendant's role in the misallocation of funds." Judge Gates shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I said it's inadmissible. End of discussion." Pam's mind raced, but she didn't show it. She had prepared for this. She had known that Judge Gates would try to obstruct the case at some point, but she had something he hadn't anticipated. She glanced at the prosecution team, who were waiting for her next move. One of them gave her a slight nod, signaling her to proceed. It was time. Time for the final act. Pam reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small recorder. She placed it on the table and pressed play. The low, gravelly voice that filled the courtroom was unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The voice crackled, continuing, "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." The courtroom was frozen in place. The air was thick with shock as everyone in the room processed what had just been revealed. Even the defense attorney's face drained of color, and the jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Gates remained still, his hands clenched into fists on the bench. He didn't speak, didn't move, but Pam could see it in his eyes. He was terrified. "I believe we've all just heard something very interesting," Pam said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I'd like to know, Your Honor, who were you talking to on that recording?" The room held its breath. The jury, the stenographer, even the reporters, everyone was waiting for Gates's response. But there was none. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. I don't know what you're talking about," Judge Gates finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Pam didn't let him off the hook. You don't? Because we all just heard you discussing how to keep me from obtaining crucial financial evidence. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The defense attorney's earlier smugness was completely gone, replaced by visible panic. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, and the gallery buzzed with disbelief. Pam let the moment hang in the air before reaching for the next piece of evidence. She tapped it on the table, letting the sound ring out. This is a transcript of a wiretap, she said coolly, legally obtained during our investigation. It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording. She turned to the bailiff, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing tension. Officer Reynolds, she said calmly, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud? The bailiff hesitated for a moment before picking up the transcript and reading aloud. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the room feel smaller, tighter. We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the gallery. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Pam could see the realization settle over the faces of everyone in the room. The corruption was deeper than they had imagined, and it wasn't just one man involved, it was a network. Pam turned to Judge Gates, who now looked like a man caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. His jaw twitched, his eyes darting around the courtroom as though searching for an escape. But it was too late. I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor, Pam said, her voice strong, her gaze unwavering. Gates remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. Finally he spoke, his voice shaky. Motion denied. Pam raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Excuse me? This hearing is over, Gates declared, his voice louder now, almost desperate. I will not allow— Judge Gates, Pam interrupted smoothly, her tone light but firm. I wasn't asking for your permission. Without waiting for him to respond, she turned to the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest nod. The sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet room, and before anyone could react, two uniformed officers appeared at the side of the courtroom. Judge Gates, one of the officers said in a firm, authoritative voice, you are under arrest. Gasps filled the room. The reporters scrambled for their phones. The jury exchanged looks of disbelief. The defense attorney stood frozen, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Judge Gates didn't speak. He didn't move. He just sat there, his expression a mixture of disbelief and outrage, as the officers stepped forward to place him in handcuffs. This is absurd, he shouted, but his voice lacked the strength it had earlier. There was no authority left in him, only fear. You have the right to remain silent, one of the officers said as they clicked the cuffs around his wrists. You are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney. Judge Gates tried to pull away, but it was no use. His hands were shackled, and his reign as judge had come to a swift and ignoble end. Pam Bondi remained seated, her face unreadable as the officers escorted Gates from the courtroom. This wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And for the first time in a long while, the scales had tipped in favor of truth. As the door to the courtroom closed behind him, Pam glanced at the defense table. The wealthy developer, Charles Lawson, who had expected the trial to be nothing more than a formality, was now scrambling to salvage what was left of his empire. She stood up, her voice calm as she addressed the courtroom. I believe we still have a trial to finish, she said. The courtroom was still in shock, but Pam Bondi knew that this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, but she had just taken the first step toward exposing the corruption that had plagued the system for far too long. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as Judge Gates was escorted out in handcuffs. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air, leaving everyone present with the sensation that they had just witnessed something monumental. It was rare for someone so powerful to fall so publicly, and even rarer for someone like Pam Bondi to stand her ground and ensure justice was served in the face of such overwhelming adversity. As the officers led Gates away, the defense attorney, Charles Lawson, stood at his table, his face pale and his hands shaking. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a man who now understood the gravity of what had just transpired. His eyes flicked nervously between Bondi and the now empty judge's seat, as if trying to decide whether to make a deal or continue the fight. But deep down, he knew the battle was already lost. Pam Bondi wasn't done yet, however. She knew the arrest of Judge Gates was a pivotal moment, but it was only a small piece of the puzzle. The true fight lay ahead. The trial was still ongoing, and the corruption didn't end with a single judge. She couldn't allow Gates' removal to overshadow the real work. It was time to finish what she had started. "Mr. Lawson," Pam said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's tension, "I believe the real question here is whether you're ready to face the consequences for your role in this scheme." The developer stiffened, his eyes darting between his lawyer and Bondi, searching for an escape, a way out. But there was no longer any safe ground for him to stand on. Pam had presented undeniable evidence, and now, with Judge Gates out of the equation, the playing field had been leveled. "Do you want to continue with the proceedings?" she asked coolly, her eyes never leaving Lawson's. "Or would you prefer to discuss a plea deal?" The defense attorney opened his mouth, but no words came out. His posture faltered, and the facade of confidence melted away. It was clear that he was trying to buy time, but time was something he no longer had. "I suggest we continue," Bondi said, her voice unwavering. "But I won't be making deals. Not after everything we've uncovered." Lawson looked around the room, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. He had underestimated Bondi, just like everyone else who thought they could manipulate the system without consequence. Now he was left with nothing but the weight of his own guilt, and the realization that Pam Bondi was no longer just a prosecutor. She was a force to be reckoned with. The rest of the trial unfolded without the previous distractions. The defense crumbled under the pressure of Bondi's evidence. Witness after witness confirmed what she had already presented: the massive financial discrepancies, the corrupt dealings, and the political favors that had been traded behind closed doors. The case was airtight, and there was nowhere for the defense to hide. When the jury returned with their verdict, there was no doubt about it. The defendant was guilty. The powerful developer who thought his wealth and connections could shield him from justice was now facing the consequences of his actions. The trial had ended, but Pam knew that this was only one victory in a much larger fight. The lesson from the story. The story of Pam Bondi's courtroom battle is a powerful reminder that no matter how high one rises in power, no one is above the law. Corruption, intimidation, and manipulation may work for a while, but the truth always has a way of surfacing, especially when it's pursued with relentless determination and integrity. Pam's victory was not just about bringing a corrupt judge to justice or exposing the developer's fraudulent actions. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity and refusing to be intimidated by the powerful. Judge Gates tried every trick in the book to discredit her, to undermine her case, and to control the trial. But Pam saw through his tactics and remained focused on the truth, never allowing his arrogance to break her resolve. The lesson here is clear: integrity, courage, and perseverance are the greatest tools one can have in the pursuit of justice. When faced with obstacles, whether it's a biased judge, a powerful opponent, or a corrupt system, standing firm in the face of adversity and adhering to your principles will ultimately bring the truth to light. In the end, it is not the loudest voice or the most powerful figure that prevails, but the one who is committed to doing what is right, no matter the cost. Pam Bondi's journey in this courtroom teaches us that, while the fight for justice may be difficult and filled with challenges, it is always worth it. And when the dust settles, those who remain true to their values will find that justice, however long it takes, will always prevail.